Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about this. This is the Satiator for the Sega Saturn, also mostly for the Sega Pluto. We'll get back into it in a second. Before we do all that stuff, though, if you guys could do me a favor, please drop a like on this video, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't done that, and if you could check out the social media stuff in the description, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, as well as my new travel channel. I would appreciate all that. Thank you very much for the support. Now, we're going to talk all about this, but I do want to kind of say something that I think is significant. Well, there's actually two things. First, huge shout out to the guys over at the Satiator for actually sending this to me for free for the purposes of review so that you guys can all see it and frankly to experience it personally. We'll get back to that. But that's an important note. But the other, and if you want to check this out or if you want to support it, you want to get one, I'll put a link in the description. That's just kind of a given at this point. But the other thing I want to say is a good chunk of this video is going to be about the Sega Pluto prototype more than the Satiator, and then eventually we'll get to the review. If you're just here for, hey, what are your thoughts on this thing? I don't care about whatever that is. Click on this time code. Go ahead, it's fine. I'll see you later. All right. Oh, okay. All right, we're continuing. So yes, the Satiator. So here's kind of what happened with this. First, I want to give a huge apology to the guys who made the Satiator. So here's what happened. Back in December 2021. We were in communication with each other because I had taken custody of the Sega Pluto prototype, which we'll get back to in a second. And they were cool enough to send me one with the idea being like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if people got to see the Satiator with the, the Pluto, and it'd be cool to do a video on. Like, that was the whole plan. They sent it to me back in January, and I included it in an episode of Playload at the time. But in the same episode, I also kind of told you guys I was going to be kind of reducing the amount of videos I was producing for a while, and not to necessarily have to revisit that, but because it was so long ago, I think I will slightly. In the beginning of January, I had just taken this long kind of mental sabbatical to deal with the fact that I had lost my mother like a year earlier, and it was just kind of like something I needed to do. And so when I came back from that, I was kind of ready to hit the ground running. And her home, my late mother's home, aka my childhood home, which I had only recently legally acquired, had a sudden explosion and a subsequent fire, essentially destroying that home. So it was kind of a lot to deal with all at once, and I just kind of shut down. I said that as much. So I really just, to be honest, didn't have the energy to talk about this thing at the time. I was like, I have way too many other things that are going through my head. So I apologize to them for how long this took, and I thank them for their patience, and I thank you guys for your patience as it's been for the course of the last year or so, but I'm trying to get back on track. So thank you very much for that support. Now, let's actually talk about things that are a little bit more exciting and fun. So what's the deal with the Sega Pluto? Why do I have it, etc.? In case you missed all the other videos I've done on it, the Sega Pluto is a prototype that Sega made as an upgraded version of the Saturn. Think like PS4 to PS4 Pro, except they never released it. And there was a lot of mystery surrounding it. We didn't have a whole lot of answers, and we tried to figure out some stuff and whatever. But ultimately, because I've been talking about it so much, and because we've taken it to so many shows and conventions and things like that, we've actually gotten some updates. Some directly from Sega and some from other people who, or at least actually worked on the project. So I'm going to give you a couple of those updates. One, Sega basically admitted that they had made 7 of these at one point. However, 5 of them were just white mock-up units. They never worked. Of those 5, they destroyed 4. One was donated to the National Video Game Museum in Frisco, Texas, which I also have done a video on. And we even did a prototype family reunion with this Pluto, the white Pluto, and the Sega Neptune all together. 3 things that shouldn't exist all coming together, because I'm the kind of lunatic that wants those things to exist in a reality. So that was pretty cool. But they made 2 functional units. Now, one of those 2 units was sent to Japan for Sega Japan's final approval. It ultimately, the project just ceased to exist. They canceled it. They didn't allow it to be. That one eventually surfaced in 2013. That was the one that hit the internet really hard back like a decade ago, where everybody was wondering what is the deal with this thing. And to be honest, that's the one you'll see more photos of when you actually look up the console. I don't know why, because I whore this thing all the time, but that's not the one I'm taking photos of. They're showing the other one. Probably because it had such a big media circus around it a decade ago. That said, That one just kind of sat. Now, this one actually surfaced in a flea market in 1999 where my buddy Roger actually bought it when he was a kid. He held on to it for a really long time, not totally sure of what it was. And eventually, when that whole 2013 incident happened, he was like, I have one. And everybody's like, no, you don't. And he was like, okay, I don't want to deal with internet drama. And he just went back to not caring about it. So how did it end up in my possession after all that weirdness? Basically, I met him in 2019, and I was like, dude, do you understand how awesome this is? So he let me, long story short, he let me borrow it. We took it to Ben Heck. He did a little bit of maintenance on it. There really wasn't much of anything wrong with it. And then he let me say, he's like, you know what, take it with you and go do things. So I take it to shows, I take it to conventions. I also take it to when I'm traveling for unrelated reasons. Like I was just talking about that little mental sabbatical I took. I was out in Guam for a while, so I took it to Guam. And you take all these cool photos of it. It's the most well-traveled console probably in the history of the world. I actually have a whole map. I actually keep track of every place it has been. Anyway, so, but anyway, so ultimately, we thought it would be really cool to take it to shows and let people play it. Now, that created a little bit of a problem because, you know, it's a prototype, and you want to kind of reduce the amount of interaction that people can have with it just because it's so rare. But we kind of took a page out of the late Terry Diebold's playbook. And he's the guy who had the Nintendo PlayStation prototype. He was a friend of mine, and I had watched him do that for a couple of years, so I kind of picked up on some of the tricks. But because we were willing to do this, because Roger was cool enough to let people go out and play it, he just had a couple of stipulations. People were willing to cooperate with that. And the first one I really want to address and give shout out to a guy named Knight of Dragon. He was cool enough to donate a set of the wireless Retrobit controllers so that people could play it, because we were always concerned, you know, somebody like a kid might pull on it and yank the thing off the table. But wireless controllers, we don't have to worry about that anymore. But that said, there was another issue with it, which was the disk drive. Now, the disk drive totally works. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is an optical disk drive, and bringing Saturn games are extraordinarily expensive. So carrying all that stuff is already difficult, but it would have been made even worse. Which is, yeah, so we wanted to see if we could eliminate that process somewhat. That's where you eventually, obviously, get into the Satiator. But before I dive into that, I just want to give a couple of PSs here to the Pluto specifically before we move on, just because anybody out there who cares about the history of the Pluto. Two little updates we have had since I've last talked about it. One, we've discovered that the controller port is a little bizarre, because if you use the Knights 3D controller on it, it doesn't boot anything. It doesn't function. Strange, don't know why. And the other one is we actually got a small comment from one of the original engineers of it, and he gave an interesting little piece of updated history. He basically said the Japanese built this at the request of Sega of America, which explains why it's region locked to the US. He said, we were forced to build it knowing full well it was unreleasable, it was a stupid idea, that's his basic phrasing on it, and it would have been prohibitively expensive. I think he roughly estimated it would have been like about $1,000 to release this thing back in like 96, which is insane. And it wouldn't have been possible for that to actually exist, but they were still forced to build the prototype. Now, why would it have been so expensive? As I mentioned before, it has a built-in modem and a built-in hard drive. This has a hard drive in it, a 512 megabyte hard drive, first console ever in history with one, beating the Xbox by 5 years. But 512 megabytes is comically small now, but in a game console in 96, that's insane. So Sega was right. They had the right idea. The internet was the future. They were just a little too early to that party. Nobody was there yet. If you ask me why it would have needed any of that extra hardware, if anybody remembers Sega Channel, which was basically Game Pass before Game Pass, I think the idea was Game Pass, or Sega Channel more accurately, for the Saturn, because a 512 megabyte hard drive would have been enough space for, in most cases, every individual game on the Saturn. Once you had downloaded it, play it, you could delete it, download a new one. That would have been enough space for one game, in most cases. But I purely speculation. He didn't comment on that. He basically just said, from an engineering standpoint, it was a stupid idea. We had to do it. So there you go. That's why it was made, apparently. Now, it does exist. We have access to it, and you have access to it if you ever go to a convention where I'm at. And we can thank Roger for that, obviously thank Night of Dragon for that, and of course the Satiator guys. So let's talk a little bit about the Satiator. What is it? How is it different? Now, the Satiator is what is called an ODE, an optical disc emulator. The concept being replace the disk drive in a console and put in a newer type of device that allows you to use more modern media, whether it's an SD card, a hard drive, some sort of USB port, etc., to basically trick the console into thinking that's where it's supposed to read its games. It's a very cool idea. I've done videos on a bunch of them in the past, like the GC loader for the GameCube, the GDMU for the Dreamcast, the mode for the Dreamcast, the mode for the Saturn, funny enough, the RIA for the Saturn. I mean, there's a bunch of them out there. But obviously, this presented a bit of a problem with the Pluto, because we thought you don't want to take the disk drive out of a prototype and then try to put an ODE in there, because there are a bunch of ODE options for the Saturn. But the Satiator was unique because it didn't require that you actually replace the disk drive. It plugs into the back. So let's talk about that back. In the back on every Sega Saturn, so if you decide you want to get a Satiator, don't think you actually need a Pluto prototype, you can have a standard one. This isn't exactly standard. It's a Hitachi High Saturn. This is a Japanese exclusive one. This will probably get its own video someday, but it looks like any other stock Saturn. And on the back, it has the this little plastic flap, and behind that is a port that goes in there. Actually, in this case, this one actually has a VCD card. I didn't even realize that was in there. I'm sorry. But yeah, wow, that wasn't a plan. I had no idea that was in there. But there's a slot back there that is usually empty. And in that, you could theoretically do something with that port. That's what Sega did. And here's the VCD card I intended to show you. This one's made by Victor. Now, Sega released these and Victor released these back in the day with certain intended features in mind. This never came out in North America. Never came out. We never saw it. We never had it, so none of our games ever used it. This did come out in Europe, but it was comically brief. The only country I'm 100% certain of that it came out in Europe was Portugal, and the only reason I know that for sure is because that's where I was able to buy the photo CD software that's compatible with this. What this card allowed you to do was have VCD support, which was a very ill-fated format for movies that really never took off in North America, and photo CD support, which is also a very dated concept now, where it's just literally photos on a CD that you could basically slideshow. And this would allow you the capability hardware-wise to do that. But beyond that, this didn't have a whole lot of other functionality. Now, some game developers decided to get creative with it. Again, none in North America, and I don't think any European game actually took advantage of it. I think it was just like technically it got a release. In Japan, that was the only place where they actually kind of utilized it a little bit. In Japan, there were some games that would get enhanced by this card being there. I actually did a video on this, like, I'm not even joking, like 10 years ago. You can look it up, where I literally made a video about the VCD card. But basically, long story short, in that video, what I showed you guys was there was a game called like Wangan Dead Heat that came out, if I remember the name correctly, and it had cutscenes of like Japanese girls like modeling cars or whatever. And if you just played it on a stock Saturn, you could see the video, but it kind of looked like the Sega CD. It was just very, pixelated. The bit rate was very low. It didn't look very good. But if you had the VCD card, then the video was much nicer. Like, not quite DVD, but like, and you have to remember the era these were made, by the way. But like, it looked good. It looked much better than the other version. So that was like the potential of it. And I think there was actually one game that actually required it, which was Lunar. I'm pretty sure Lunar required the VCD card, and I don't think there was any other game that actually did, but I could definitely be wrong about that. Point is, the only place where it got any sort of activity was Japan. Other than that, the slot was never used. It was just sat there and waiting. And a few years ago, there was a video that kind of went viral in the retro community, which was a guy had basically kind of tinkered with that slot and realized you could essentially hack the Saturn through it. It was able to bypass the disc wobble protection, which is that little line that the Saturn uses on discs to detect if the disc is real or pirated. It could bypass that, and it could unlock a whole other host of features. Now, I don't know this to be 100% certain, but I'm pretty sure what was born of that discovery was the Satiator. Now, the Satiator is super comically easy to use. It just plugs right into the back of that VCD slot, just like, say, an EverDrive would into any sort of cartridge console. Much like an EverDrive, which has become kind of the gold standard of what is a device like this, even though it's not the same tech, it has an SD card slot. One thing I really like about this is that it uses a full-size SD card, which you would think wouldn't be that big of a deal, but I am so sick of things using micro SD because I never have those laying around. I have more devices that need them than I have the cards, whereas it's exactly the opposite with the full-size cards. I have tons of those laying around, which is great, especially for older media like this where you don't actually need a massive card. That said, the Satiator does support up to 1 terabyte SD cards. Look, man, I love the Saturn, but there's no way you're going to fill up a 1 terabyte SD card with Saturn ISOs. It's not happening. Like the full American set, plus like the European exclusives, all of that combined isn't even 300 games. Like that's not going to come anywhere near that. With every game kind of averaging, this is an average, around 300 to 400 megabytes. Not even close. Now, granted, the Japanese library is substantially bigger. It's like an additional 1,600 games or something like that, something ridiculous. But even that, all that combined, uncompressed, you're not hitting a terabyte. Hell, I'd be surprised if you even hit the 512 cards. But I guess I don't fully, totally know that without ripping every single disc. Point is, you could, if you wanted to, if you were dedicated enough, fit every single Sega Saturn game ever produced, ever, onto this device. It is very possible. As for the card itself, it supports multiple formats. They have actually recently updated it so that it now supports a couple like bin and queue. I think originally it was just ISO, but now it supports multiple Sega Saturn game formats, so it's less of an issue. It also, I believe the card has to be FAT32, if I remember correctly, which is not that big of a deal. But you would want to double check their website on that. Those are like the small technical things. Either way, the point is, it's really easy to set this thing up. It does have firmware updates, which is also comically easy. It has a micro USB port on the back, which I'm not a big fan of micro USB, but the amount of times you will actually interact with this port is incredibly minimal. I don't know if it has any additional developer functions on it, but it actually, if it does, that would be the one time you might actually need it. But other than that, you really almost never have to use that port. The one purpose to it that I have, and I actually think is really cool, is its ability to firmware update through that port, but not necessarily the way you might imagine. It's not like you connect it to the PC and then drag files over. No. What you do is you go to the website of these guys, and they have the latest firmwares there, and they have the latest menu. There's 2 files. You put them on the root of the SD card, and once they're there, you just put the SD card back in this thing. At that point, if you want, you can update it by plugging it into the back of the Saturn and turning the Saturn on. Or, and this is kind of unique because I don't think there's any other, I've never seen like an EverDrive or any other ODE that actually worked this way. If you want, and I'll show you right now, you can just plug this into a power outlet and it will update. It turns red when it's on, and then once the update's complete, it just kind of flashes in cycles of green, like 3 cycles, and then that's how you know it's done. You can unplug it, it's been successfully updated. Once you've done the firmware update, though, I do recommend you take the card, put it back in your computer, and then take the firmware file off and just leave the menu file on. This would be the point where you add your games. I recommend creating a folder for every single game and then putting the games in there. It makes it work cleaner. Now, where you actually get those games is up to you. Personally, I recommend ripping your own if you have that option, that luxury, shall we say. But otherwise, there is the high seas of the internet, which I imagine is where most people would go. But either way, this is the time to do that. But there's really not much else to it than that. It's super simple. So let me show you a little bit of it in action here. We'll plug it directly into the Pluto, putting it right back there. It also has this little plastic handle on it that kind of retracts that allows you to easily pull it out of the console. So we'll turn it on, and what you're going to see first is the, I have the sound muted, by the way, but you're going to see the Saturn menu, and then you'll see it goes to that like screen that you kind of get for a second, and then from there it boots into the menu. That's the menu file. So from there, it just has a whole bunch of games. Now, every single one of these games was cherry-picked by the Sega Saturn community so that I could have these at different conventions and people could get just kind of like a sample of what the Saturn is. Some of the highlights, as it were. And we'll pick something in a second. Actually, yeah, I'll just put on, I'm going to put on Dead or Alive for a very specific reason. I'll just let it run. Now, and if I look at it in the back here, the satiator light is green, which is cool. They have addressed a few different bugs that have come up with it that have been firmware patched out. They seem to still be pretty on top of this project, which is pretty nice. And as you can see, it works very well. The card I have in there is comically small. It's only 16 gigabytes and it still hosts all those games. There's actually more below it. I just kind of did a selection because I didn't want it to be too overwhelming at a convention, for example. Now, one thing that's really neat about it, the Pluto, as I mentioned before, is region locked. You cannot get around it, even with the like action replay stuff or the pseudo Saturn, which I did a whole video on. None of those will work on the Pluto specifically. So we thought we were completely locked to American titles. Satiator allows us to bypass that. Hence, you're seeing Dead or Alive. This is a Japanese exclusive game, and it's totally working just fine on the Pluto, which is fantastic. I really have essentially no complaints about the Satiator itself. It has only ever kind of failed me a handful of times, and in like the smallest way possible. Earlier, when I booted it up, you saw the splash screen, and then you saw like the Saturn BIOS for a second, and then it booted into the menu, right? There's been a handful of times where it went past the splash screen, it got to that Saturn menu, you know, where you would play around with settings or whatever, and it just hung. It just never went anywhere. Like, it didn't stall. You could still click around. It just wouldn't do anything. You know how I solved that? Turn it off, turn it back on, and it would work. It has never done that in 2 sequences, ever. And I also just firmware updated it, so it's possible that problem doesn't even exist anymore. But I'm telling you, that's the only issue I ever had with it. The one, I didn't personally run into this, but I do know this is a thing, and it's kind of an impossible thing to ignore. Earlier, I was talking about those games that were either enhanced by it, such as Wangan Dead Heat, or games that require it, such as Lunar. Those are the only games that are kind of a victim of the Satiator, meaning because the Satiator is taking up the VCD card slot, it is not possible to actually use the VCD card itself in them. Thus, you cannot get the better video quality, or in Lunar's case, the game straight up will not function. And if there were any games that actually use the photo CD benefits, and I have to think there were at least some, either they're going to work in a more limited capacity than they're technically capable of doing, or they straight up don't work. But I don't know those games in particular, if they even exist. That's like a hypothetical. That's the only downside to the Satiator, and I'm not sure that's actually fixable, because it literally is utilizing the exact same port, unless there's a way through a firmware update, for the Satiator to replicate the functionality of the VCD card slot while also reading games through it. I don't know if that's hardware possible. I'm not an engineer. Maybe the Satiator guys would know that, but I can't imagine they're unaware of this problem either. But that's at best a very limited thing, because as I said, it only was for certain Japanese games, and even then it was very, very few. So yeah, that's kind of it. I can't recommend it enough. I think it's great. I think it was amazing they donated it to us just so you guys would have the opportunity to play it at conventions, the Pluto specifically. If you ever want to see this at a convention, the way that usually works, contact your retro game convention and be like, I want that YouTube nerd with his thing, and I want them there, and I want to play it. Because you can get that. It's very possible. I'm willing to travel. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I can tell you about the Pluto that we have since discovered that was kind of interesting for one reason or another. Oh, we did notice that there was a RAM issue. Not necessarily an issue so much as something different. It's 2 parts. One, when Ben Heck took this apart, he noticed there was like an extra little chip on it that he thought was RAM. And again, we are still in that place of we think it's RAM, but we're not totally sure. But that would add to the... We thought maybe it would be RAM. You know how the Saturn had those cartridge slots where there's some Japanese games that utilize that RAM and then whatever, you know, it would be better. Turns out it's not for that. It's not the same RAM. We tried Marvel Superheroes, which was the only American game to use the RAM. It doesn't see it. And when we use the Satiator and a RAM cartridge, for example, it too does not recognize that. So it does recognize the RAM cartridge when using the Satiator, like if you have the dedicated specific one, but the internal extra RAM, whatever that is not the same thing, which seems odd, but all right. And the other thing we noticed about it is, you know how you turn on a Saturn and the clock is always dead and it's asking you what time it is? Did you notice when I turned on the Pluto, it didn't do that? We've checked on certain games. The time is correct to this day, right now, to this minute. How? Why? Don't know. It's possible that the memory data for that is actually stored in the RAM, but we don't know. The truth is we don't know. Somebody noticed that at a convention. They're like, did you set the time? And I was like, no. And it dawned on us all, like, none of us ever said it. I asked Ben if he said it. He said he didn't. Roger never said it, which means somebody at Sega said it in the mid-90s, and there it still is, because none of us ever did it. Anyway, so yeah, that's the Pluto. Hopefully you guys can see it at some point. It might be at Portland Retro Game Expo. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And that's also the Satiator. I highly recommend this thing. I had a blast with it. As you can see, it works very well. It has played every game I threw at it, other than the ones that were kind of an asterisk, which I mentioned before. But yeah, it's a great product. It's a little expensive, I admit that, but it's when you think about the Sega Saturn and its library and how expensive it is, it's kind of like just buying one of the expensive games and never needing it again. I have to be honest with you. I never really advocate piracy. You know, but there are some platforms where you just go, dude, there's no other option. Like Neo Geo AES is one of those where don't feel guilty about pirating that. Just, it's understandable. The Saturn is in that same boat. The games aren't as expensive as Neo Geo AES, but they're essentially impossible to get. Either way, enjoy the Saturn, enjoy the Satiator. This will enhance that experience. So thank you. Thank you very much to the guys over at the Satiator for sending this to me. Once again, sorry for the delay on it. I'm just sorry. That's all I can say about that. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you want to get this, the link's in the description, as well as all my social media stuff, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, etc. You can also follow this thing on its further adventures. There are so many weird pictures of me with this thing around the world on my Instagram. You should check those out. But yeah, also check out the Flying channel, because this also makes a lot of cameos in that. Thank you very much for watching, everybody, and I'll see you all later.